So before we start, I had a couple of people complain last week that the video I brought out as my Sunday 5 p.m. explainer was too long. Well, every Sunday at 5 p.m. on all my social media, I bring out a long form video. It will be explaining politics. It will be explaining councils, authoritarianism, net zero, political parties, what goes on behind the scenes, anything that affects the UK in a bad way, what the EU are up to. It could be a number of topics that I will cover in these 5 p.m. Sunday explainers. I'm putting them multi-platform, so they go out everywhere: Facebook, YouTube, X, TikTok. Instagram's probably the only one I don't put it on because they don't do long-form videos, and Spotify as well now. So if you want to listen to these properly, YouTube is probably the place to go. You can watch it on the app, on your telly, pause it, get a cup of tea, play it, stop it, start it whenever you want. Otherwise, it's on everywhere else. But if you're expecting this to be a 3-minute reel, that it is not. And today, we're going to be talking about authoritarianism, because we are teetering on the edge in the United Kingdom of a very big problem.
Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
Because what if I told you the biggest threat to democracy in Britain isn't a party, a leader, or a law, but the slow death of disagreement itself? Back in 2024, I went over this, but I think it's more prevalent now in 2026. This is not a video about secret cabals or hidden plots. I've done those before. It's not about claiming Labour is a communist party, and it's not about nostalgia for Cold War politics. This is about patterns of behaviour that we've seen over the past 2 years. Because history shows us that authoritarian systems don't usually begin with force. They actually begin with permission. Permission to silence, permission to exclude, permission to decide which opinions are acceptable and which are dangerous. And once that permission exists, it spreads. What makes this moment different is that these tactics are no longer confined to authoritarian states overseas. Many critics argue they are now appearing in softer form across Western democracies, Britain included. Not through tanks in the streets, but through media framing, cultural pressure, language control, and social punishment. We are actually living through a period of global instability, economic pressure, migration crises, energy insecurity, technological upheaval, wars on Europe's doorstep, and history tells us that when societies feel stressed, political movements become less tolerant of dissent. That's not a left-wing trait or a right-wing one. That's just a human one. And that's why this conversation matters now, because democracy doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes quietly while people argue about whether it's even happening at all. So first up, let's talk about authoritarianism as a method, not a party. See, one of the biggest mistakes people make when talking about authoritarianism is assuming it belongs to a specific ideology. People picture uniforms, they picture flags, they picture regimes overseas. But authoritarianism is not an aesthetic, it's a method. At its core, authoritarianism is defined by how power responds to challenge. Healthy systems invite scrutiny. Authoritarian systems punish it. Historically, communist regimes understood this better than anyone. They didn't rely solely on violence. In fact, violence was often the last resort. The real work happened earlier. They controlled the narrative, they framed dissent as dangerous, they convinced ordinary people that disagreement itself threatened social stability. And once that took hold, the system sustained itself. You didn't need to arrest everyone, you just needed people to self-censor. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Those techniques were never unique to communism, they were simply perfected there. You see, we've seen similar patterns in Maoist China, the Soviet Union, East Germany, Cuba, Venezuela, and more recently in authoritarian-leaning states across parts of Asia, Africa, and South America. Different cultures, different slogans, same playbook. And when you strip it back, the ideology matters less than the behavior. The moment a political movement decides that some ideas should not be heard, that some people should not speak, and that questioning the narrative is morally suspect, it crosses a line. That's not democracy anymore, that is control. And this matters because no society is immune. Western democracies, like Britain, often assume we're too stable, too advanced, too educated for this to happen here. But we're seeing it play out in real time. History is littered with societies that thought exactly the same way. And that brings us on to state censorship and social enforcement. You see, in the 20th century, authoritarian regimes relied on blunt tools, censorship boards, state broadcasters, banned books, secret police. And these methods were obvious, and because they were obvious, they were resisted. But in today's modern world, those tools are inefficient. You don't need to silence people directly if you can make speaking costly. Today, control is decentralized. Algorithms decide who gets seen. Platforms decide what's acceptable. Employers decide what's risky. Social pressure decides what's normal. And we're seeing this actively play out on apps like TikTok. Most people who were political commentators last year getting good views are seeing barely 1,000 now on their videos. So it's happening. It is not theoretical, we are seeing it globally. In Canada, academics have faced investigations for controversial speech. In Germany, speech laws have expanded rapidly in the name of safety. In Australia, pandemic-era restrictions reshaped the boundaries of acceptable debate. And across the EU, online speech regulation has tightened significantly. And I'll bring you a bit more on them later. And the UK is certainly not isolated from this trend. The modern model doesn't require government orders, it relies on social enforcement. If an opinion is framed as harmful, people feel justified in silencing it. If a viewpoint is labelled dangerous, platforms feel justified in suppressing it. If a speaker is portrayed as morally suspect, employers feel justified in distancing themselves. And here's the key point. Once enforcement is social, responsibility disappears. No one feels accountable. Everyone is just following standards. That's exactly how authoritarian behavior becomes normalized without anyone ever voting for it. Next up, we need to look at intellectual elitism and the delegitimization of ordinary voices. Because another hallmark of authoritarian thinking is who actually gets to speak. In healthy democracies, ideas stand or fall on their own merit. In authoritarian-leaning cultures, credibility is pre-decided. And we see this constantly in modern political commentary. Working class voices dismissed as ignorant, concerns framed as emotional rather than rational, life experience treated as inferior to academic theory. Critics often point to figures like James O'Brien as emblematic of this exact mindset. Rather than dismantling opposing arguments line by line, dissenters are frequently portrayed as unintelligent, misinformed, or incapable of understanding complex issues. The implication is clear. If you disagree, you must be deficient. But intelligence is not owned by universities or broadcasters. Tradespeople understand systems. Parents understand incentives. Workers understand consequences. Citizens understand lived reality. And history shows that when elites convince themselves that only they are capable of understanding truth, well, they stop listening. And when elites stop listening, societies fracture. This is not about anti-intellectualism, it's about humility, and authoritarian systems never tolerate humility. And that moves us on to the next chapter, labelling stigma and the end of debate. You see, every authoritarian system in history relied on labels. Labels are efficient. They end conversations instantly. In the past, it was counter-revolutionary. Today, it's far-right, extremist, or problematic. And once applied, the argument no longer matters. We saw this clearly during periods of unrest when Keir Starmer publicly described participants as far-right extremists, despite many protests being driven by concerns around immigration policy rather than ideology. And the effect was immediate. The grievances were sidelined, the debate ended, the label did the work. But it's wearing a bit thin now. This tactic isn't about accuracy, it's about containment. And it mirrors global patterns. In France, protesters are routinely framed as extremists. In the US, political opponents are morally caricatured. Across Europe, dissent is increasingly described as dangerous rather than debated, because once labels replace discussion, democracy becomes performative. People are allowed to vote, just not to question. And that brings us on to cancel culture as modern political discipline. And before we get into that, let's just take a tiny little break. As a reminder, I have actually published a book called Politics for People Who Don't Give a Toss About Politics, but I urge you, pause the video, go get yourself a cup of tea, sit back down, and we'll get into the second part next.
Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
You see, in historical authoritarian regimes, dissent was punished directly. In modern democracies, punishment is outsourced. Cancel culture is not about accountability, it's about deterrence. Mass reporting, deplatforming, public shaming, professional consequences. No police required. The message is subtle but powerful, so speak carefully. People don't need to be silenced themselves to learn the lesson. They just need to see it happen to somebody else, and then they self-censor. That chilling effect spreads fast. And once enough people self-censor, ideological conformity becomes the default. Not because everybody agrees, but because disagreement is too risky. That is one of the most dangerous conditions any democracy can ever enter. So next up, we need to talk about language control and the narrowing of thought. You see, every authoritarian system, without exception, begins to reshape language. Not all at once, not obviously, but deliberately. Words are powerful because they frame how people think before they even realize they're thinking. And historically, communist regimes understood this instinctively. They didn't just control actions, they controlled meaning. Words like equality were stripped of nuance and turned into tools of enforcement. Justice became selective punishment. Safety became justification for repression. And once language is captured, thought follows. And we're now seeing very similar patterns across modern Western politics. Terms like free speech are increasingly reframed as something conditional, something that must be managed, something that becomes harmful the moment it challenges prevailing narratives. Speech is no longer judged by truth or evidence, but by impact. And impact is subjective. What this does is quietly redraw the boundaries of acceptable discussion. If questioning policy is framed as harmful, debate ends. If raising concerns is framed as dangerous, scrutiny disappears. And if disagreement is reframed as hostility, silence becomes virtue. This is not accidental, it is functional, and it has been tried and tested throughout history. And globally, we are seeing this happening everywhere. In the EU, digital regulation increasingly focuses on misinformation without clear definitions. In Canada, speech is evaluated through harm-based frameworks rather than intent, and in the UK, public bodies increasingly prioritise safe spaces over open discussion. Once language becomes elastic, and once power decides meaning, democracy becomes fragile. And that moves us on to the online enforcement and the illusion of consensus in the modern age. One of the most effective modern authoritarian tools is the illusion of consensus. Social media is perfectly designed for this. Algorithms reward conformity, outrage spreads faster than nuance, and volume replaces substance. Spend time in the comments of any fact-based criticism of Labour policy, and the pattern is utterly predictable. First comes denial, then deflection, then moral condemnation, often from anonymous accounts, grey profile pictures, no content, no accountability, because this isn't organic debate, it's enforcement by proxy, and it creates a powerful illusion. It makes dissent appear fringe even when it isn't. Globally, this tactic is absolutely everywhere. In the US, coordinated online activism shapes perceived public opinion. In Europe, digital mobs pressure platforms into moderation decisions, and in authoritarian states, the same tactics are openly state-directed. The difference in Britain is subtlety. Only a few people in Britain are told what to do, and they believe they're doing it voluntarily, and then the sheep follow. That's what makes it effective. When enforcement becomes cultural, nobody feels responsible. And that moves us on to the political treatment of outsiders. You see, the way a system treats political outsiders tells you everything about its health. Look at how non-establishment movements are treated, not debated, dismissed. Their policies are rarely examined in detail. Their supporters are caricatured. Their concerns are framed as moral defects. That's not persuasion, it's containment. Globally, we see this again everywhere. Populist movements in Europe are branded as dangerous before debate begins. wins. Opposition figures in Canada and Australia are marginalised through moral framing. Even in supposedly liberal democracies, outsider politics is treated as a threat rather than a viewpoint. And this was on full display yesterday in Prime Minister's Questions when Keir Starmer's opening line in 2026 was to mock Reform UK. This is exactly how authoritarian systems protect themselves. They don't defeat ideas, they quarantine them. And once a movement is quarantined, facts no longer matter. And this is why global crises accelerate authoritarian behavior. Because it does not emerge in a vacuum, it thrives in crisis, and we're living through overlapping global pressures. Global economic stagnation, energy insecurity, rapid demographic change, technological disruption, war in Europe, geopolitical instability. History shows us that during periods of stress, political systems become less tolerant of dissent. This happened during the Great Depression. It happened after the First World War. It happened throughout the Cold War. And it's happening again right now. When leaders feel pressure and criticism becomes inconvenient, when systems feel fragile, debate becomes dangerous. That's not ideology, that is a survival instinct. The danger is that emergency thinking becomes permanent because they start to lace this into policy and legislation. Temporary restrictions harden into norms and exceptional measures become standard practice, and the public slowly adapts. One of the most significant changes under the EU's Digital Service Act isn't just faster content removal, it's who now gets to trigger it. Because under the rules, platforms must give priority treatment to so-called trusted or approved flaggers. These are organisations authorised by an EU member state to report content they believe is illegal, with platforms expected to act quickly and with limited challenge. And here's the problem. Illegal content under EU law doesn't mean one clear standard. It includes anything that breaches any EU regulation or the national law of any member state. Different countries, different thresholds, but a single enforcement pipeline. And once an organisation is approved in one EU country, its influence can extend across borders. That means standards set in one political or legal culture can shape what is removed elsewhere without courts, juries, or democratic oversight. These flaggers are not judges. They are often NGOs or advisory groups, unelected and ideologically aligned, yet granted fast-track power over what stays online. And the real impact isn't just takedowns, it's deterrence. Platforms comply to avoid penalties, users self-censor, and lawful but conversational speech quietly disappears. This is censorship by delegation, outsourced, cross-border, and largely invisible. But ultimately, this is not about Labour as a party. We have to be absolutely clear. This is not a claim about secret agendas or hidden takeovers. I've already discussed those. This is about actual behaviour, not branding. You see, certain activist factions within Labour's support base openly embrace authoritarian tactics. They believe moral certainty justifies suppression. They believe dissent causes harm. They believe debate legitimizes opposition. And history tells us exactly where that logic leads. Every single authoritarian system believed it was acting for the greater good. None of them ever thought they were the villains. That's what makes this dangerous. And my conclusion to all of this: democracy does not die with a coup. It doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes quietly. It erodes when people stop speaking, when debate becomes dangerous, and when disengagement becomes immoral. You don't need tanks. You don't need secret police. You just need silence. This is not left versus right. It is open debate versus ideological enforcement. And the people who shout loudest about morality are often the least willing to defend freedom. So I urge you, question narratives, demand evidence, refuse labels, because history is brutally honest about this. Authoritarian systems do not fear violence, they fear discussion, and democracy only survives when ordinary people refuse to be silenced. And I personally feel that 2026 is going to be the year we see tremendous clampdowns on political and news commentary online.